Good morning. It's 7:36 on this Thursday morning. It's Rachel Burden and Chris Warburton with you on Five Live Breakfast. Now to a discussion that some listeners may find distressing. Every day in the UK, 11 babies are stillborn. That's more than 3,600 stillbirths every single year. Health officials have now launched new guidelines designed to provide the best care for families affected by stillbirths. And it's hoped the latest advice released to mark Baby Loss Awareness Week will ensure everybody experiences the same high standard of care when a baby dies. And, we're focusing on it, on fathers in particular, Rachel.
Well, the impact on the whole family when there is a stillbirth within that family. I was at an event recently talking to midwives about my experiences, and I met Chris, who's one of our next guests there, and we talked about our own experiences, and Chris had experienced a stillbirth. And as a result of that, I thought we don't maybe perhaps hear dads quite so much talking about this, which is not in any way to underplay the extreme trauma that mothers go through. But today we thought we'd look at the impact on the whole family.
Indeed. And we can say hello to Chris Binney. How are you, Chris?
Hi, Chris.
Good, thank you. Good morning.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks for coming in. And David Monteith is with us as well. Hello, David.
Hello, how you doing?
Morning. Yeah, very well, thank you. Now, Chris's son, Henry, was stillborn on the same night as David's daughter, Grace. Tell us what happened, Chris. I want to get both of your stories, obviously, but Chris, was there anything different about the pregnancy, anything unusual about the pregnancy, and even the early stages of labour?
No, my wife's pregnancy was trouble-free, and she had a routine appointment 2 days before she was due to be induced, and unfortunately that's when she discovered that Henry had passed away. But up to that point, it had been absolutely problem-free.
Yeah. And what about you, David?
The same, absolutely problem-free, right up to the waters had broken. We were all happy, getting ready for it, called the midwife. She couldn't find a heartbeat. We went into the hospital to make sure and were told, I'm sorry. And it was something we hadn't even considered. And it shook us completely. And up till then, I think we'd heard about stillbirth, but it was just one of those things. And what the latest research is showing, that 50% of them could be avoided. So it was a real shock to us that just hit us in the face out of the blue.
Chris, David, just that moment, that, I don't know, panic, I don't suppose really describes it, just when you cannot find the heartbeat. What on earth are you doing? What's going through your head? What kind of emotions are emerging?
Well, for us, I was 2.5 hours away. My wife had to call me to tell me that she'd been in for an appointment and discovered that Henry passed away. And I think the overriding emotion is numbness, because you just don't see it coming. Like David said, it just hits you like a brick wall, and you don't know where you're going to go from there.
For me, it was denial at first, because we had to drive into the hospital for confirmation, and I'm driving thinking, no, this is, obviously it'll be fine, and then it's not. And like Chris said, this kind of complete absence of anything, of disbelief, really.
That's interesting, because you kind of touch on that in the poem that we heard you read so powerfully about an hour ago, David. Denial. Was there a belief for a short time, at least, that you thought that you might be able to do something about this situation?
I just, not that I could do something about it, but that they'd got something wrong.
Yeah.
They must have. I mean, they simply must have. How could this be?
So what happens? Talk us through the next bit of the process when you've begun to accept, I suppose, what's happening around you, Chris. Then what has to happen next?
I suppose this is the bit that nobody thinks about, that actually labour and birth have to carry on essentially as normal, but obviously not as normal. So you're just on the same normal process as you would be.
Well, what conversations are they having you about what that's going to be like for the both of you?
I think it's very difficult for the professionals as well, because they're not dealing with that every day either. So those conversations have to centre around kindness and compassion rather than anything more clinical. But there has to be the clinical element of, this is the process that we're going to go through, but they have to approach it in a very different way. I
just imagine that is the most harrowing thing.
It was a big shock for me to realise, in my head, I thought that our baby has died and that's it, it's over. And then suddenly it permeates your brain. hold on, we've still got to go through birth. And do we wait for that to happen naturally? Do we go for an induction? And one of the wonderful things that happened at the hospital we were at was one of the midwives said, I've looked at your notes and I saw that you wanted a water birth. Let's see if we can get the pool. And we got the pool. And what you have to bear in mind is that regardless of the baby dying, birth experience is still important. It's still up to those health workers then to kind of mitigate that trauma as best they can by making the birth experience something as easy as possible.
And then do you have time with the baby afterwards, David? What was that situation like?
We did. My wife had problems delivering the placenta, so for about 4 hours, my baby had to sit in the corner. It just felt so horrific. No father's meant to leave their baby in a corner, and I had to. But after that, we got to hold her. We had a cold cot so that we could. They had a suite that we could go to, and we spent the night there with Grace. And it was just amazing to be able to do that, to spend one night with her, even if she couldn't hug us back.
And I think you had a couple of days with Henry yourself, Chris.
Yes, we had a couple of days. So Henry was born on the Friday evening, and we went home on the Sunday afternoon. And we were very lucky that our hospital had a dedicated bereavement suite for that. I listened to some of the senior professionals talk yesterday, and there's still a third of hospitals in the UK that don't have those suites available for parents.
And what does that provide? I mean, are there people who can give you counselling in that immediate period?
I don't think it's more counselling, because I don't think you'd be able to process counselling at that stage.
Yeah.
But what it does give you is it gives you a safe space away from normal delivery rooms, crying babies, the normal hustle and bustle of what everybody assumes a maternity unit's going to be. I think it's really important to have a bubble in which you can spend time with your baby away from all of that normality.
And that moment, I mean, when you then leave the hospital and go home, I mean, that must be when you're suddenly back in your own environment and you've got the preparations in place.
Yeah, I think for me, that was the hardest point.
Yeah.
The point at which you walk away from the hospital and you have to leave your son behind. For me, that's the point at which it really hit me, because you're leaving that bubble that you've been in for a couple of days, and you're stepping back out into the world, the car park of the hospital, the drive back home, and actually that's when it really hits you. Yeah. This is going to be it for now, forever.
I remember leaving the hospital, and my wife, I was looking around. Like, everything was really weird. And I noticed my wife was doing the same thing. And we just looked at each other and went, everything's changed. The world literally looked different. And I look back and go, that was the point that really I realised I had changed forever.
What about the kind of dealing with this on an ongoing basis, and the fact that I know you two sort of have found each other and have talked to each other and formed a great friendship, but for other fathers and perhaps siblings who find themselves as well affected by this situation, as well as, of course, mothers, how easy is it? What sort of support is there?
I think social media plays an enormous part in being able to connect parents. I don't think that the majority of society realises that there's this sort of unspoken community out there that nobody talks about, of parents in the same situation that we're in. But they are everywhere. And Chris has already said 15 babies a day. That community is there everywhere. So if you look for it, you'll find it.
Did you find it easy to talk about, Chris, with your friends, with other male friends?
No, I think it's really difficult for men, because I think we have this perception in society that blokes are meant to be strong and they're just meant to put our front on, dust themselves off and go again.
Still pervades.
Absolutely. Certainly in situations like this. I know I spent the first few months repeatedly fielding the question, how's Bryony doing? And I can count on the fingers of one hand, with the possible exception of other people in that community, the number of times anybody said to me, and how are you doing? Yeah. Because the perception is always that maternity and everything that goes with it, childbirth, is a mother's thing. And actually, when you're in this situation, it impacts everybody.
Was that a similar thing for you, Dave? What was it like with, friends, family, colleagues as well, I suppose, the understanding of people who you're seeing every day?
It was, I mean, the worst thing about colleagues is having to repeat it again. and again and again. But it was, and we have an incredibly supportive group of people around us. But that thing still existed to a certain extent, and I really feel for those who don't have that kind of support. And as an example, I had the privilege to speak about stillbirth and grace in America earlier this year, and I spoke about the problem with being strong, being that your wife may be there crying, and she'll look at you, who you think you're being strong, and all she sees is someone not crying, and she's starting to think, well, why am I weird? Am I the weird one because I'm crying? Why is he not crying? And I spoke about this, and afterwards a couple came up to me to talk, and I turned to say hello, and before I could finish saying hello, the man, who was this Texan guy, just grabbed me, put his head in my chest and cried for 3 minutes. And his wife looked at me and said, we lost our son a year ago, and he hasn't. And this is the first time he's felt like he's had permission to talk about it in a year? Ridiculous.
Look, really appreciate both of you talking to us about this morning. It's a very important issue, and obviously to hear it from the father's perspective is slightly different, and it's very important to do so. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chris Binney, and thank you to you as well, David.
Thank you.
David Monteith. And let me urge you, when the programme comes to an end, if you listen on the iPlayer radio app, David has written and he has essentially read the poem I Pause that he wrote.
I think we're going to tweet it out a bit later on. We'll share it on Facebook as well. So as soon as we've got that, we'll let you know.
We'll play it later on, I think. But I urge you to listen to that a little bit later on, or hang around with us to do that. But it is 7:47 now.
Hey, Chris Warburton and Rachel Burden here with you on 5 Live this morning. Every day in the UK, 11 babies are stillborn. Now, that's more than 3,600 stillbirths every year. Health officials have now launched new guidelines designed to provide the best care for families affected by stillbirths. And it's hoped the latest advice will ensure that everybody experiences the same high standard of care when a baby dies. We also know that the work of obstetricians and paediatricians and neonatal care right throughout the country has been very much focused on bringing down the rates of stillbirth in this country, but it is still relatively high. We're going to speak now to the MP Will Quince, who lost his son. He was stillborn, and will set up the all-party group on baby loss. Good morning.
Morning.
And we want to acknowledge the fact that it's the 3rd anniversary of your baby's stillbirth today.
So it's 3 years today, so particularly poignant that this is part of Baby Loss Awareness Week as well, which is coincidental. But it makes this week all the more important for me personally.
Yeah. What's it like for you and for your partner and for the family?
Well, I think it is really tough. And, although we've had, another daughter since, it doesn't take away the pain, or in fact that you of course remember. But having said all that, all of the work that we're doing, I didn't come into politics to be a baby loss campaigner. It was a tragic event 3 years ago today that brought this about. But it has now become an absolute passion. And you're right, our stillbirth and neonatal death rates are too high. And we've got to make sure that even if we do achieve all those government targets, which are ambitious now, I'm pleased to say, we're still going to have thousands of babies that die every year. So we have got to make sure that we have world-class bereavement care in place.
How do you remember your son today? Do you mark it in some way?
Yes, I'm in Parliament today, so I won't see my wife until quite late tonight. Although we have sort of been exchanging messages, and I spoke to her briefly this morning. But we do, and things like we always have a birthday cake, which our other two children. Our youngest was only 2.5 at the time, so she doesn't remember very much. But we very much remind her that she had a baby brother, and it's a very important part of her life. He's not with us. But it's very important that we do recognise that he was a member of the family.
Yeah, and you will always be, a father of 3 in that sense.
Correct, yeah.
And we're talking about the impact because, of course, there is untold trauma that a woman goes through when giving birth to a stillborn baby. But we're also today looking at the impact on the whole family. We've talked about the dad's experience. I'm curious to know how do you explain it to a 2.5-year-old?
It's really hard, actually, and I think in our case, because our son had a very rare chromosomal disorder, we knew from about 22 weeks his chances were very slim, but he still went full term to 41 weeks. So we were able to some extent set our our daughter's expectations as to what was likely to happen. But we've got to remember the vast majority of stillbirths and neonatal deaths are sudden and unexpected. So actually, it is often a conversation after the fact with siblings. It's really tough, and that is often the dad that is doing that.
Yeah. Interestingly, the two dads we spoke to earlier, they both had that, as you say, sudden loss. It was a case of going for a checkup and being told there was no heartbeat there. And one of the moments they described as finding the most difficult was leaving the hospital without a child, and going back to the home that was prepared for a child.
Yeah, there's no question that's the case. And we deliberately set up the all-party parliamentary group with co-chairs. So I've got Antoinette Sambach, who's a colleague of mine, and we wanted to make sure that we also had a dad co-chairing, which is why I was so keen to do it, to make sure that dads' voices are heard, because I think there's a number of reasons why. I think the dads are as affected as mums. It's very different, but we're often the ones there that are comforting our partner. I think wrongly, but we do feel like that we shouldn't show emotion, and we've got to be there to be strong for our partner. We therefore hide our grief. We don't have the same support networks in many cases, but we do see everything. We've seen our partners going through the most traumatic experience imaginable. As you say, we often then go and tell the siblings and wider family, make funeral arrangements and register the death. And it's really hard. There's no question it's hard. And I think the reason I think there needs to be a real focus on men in particular, because they're often forgotten, and it does cause mental health issues, days, weeks, months, and sometimes even years later.
Please, I do not want anyone to think that we're not in some way undermining the kind of extreme grief that a mother goes through, but it is another side of the story that we want to look at. And what can be done then? Because as I understand it, hospitals are getting much better in the main at acknowledging the fact that parents need to be treated with great sensitivity in the aftermath of a stillbirth and be given time with the child and an ability to remember the child and treat it almost as, absolutely as their own, almost as a living child in a way, a sense that they have ownership over this little person.
You're absolutely right, and I think we do have some of the best care literally across the world in this area, but sadly it's patchy across the NHS, and that's very much what the National Bereavement Care Pathway, which has launched this week, is all about. And you're right, it's it's the insensitivity or lack of sensitivity that often cause so much of the issue. Just a midwife or nurse coming in, and yes, you're there with your baby who has sadly lost their life, but just coming in and say, "Gosh, isn't she beautiful?" or "Isn't he beautiful?" That makes such a difference to the parent. So just how you're spoken to, how they speak about you and your child, recognising the fact you are still a parent. Just because your child's not with you, it doesn't mean you're not a parent. And so actually rolling out this best case, the best practice, which is the National Bereavement Care Pathway. We've now got 11 trusts which have launched this week. The plan is to launch another 11 in the coming months, and then roll out nationwide by the end of the year. So we do have that consistent, patient-led, individualised level of care that's sensitive, really, really important.
Yeah. Well, thinking of you and all your family today, and thank you very much for talking to us.
Pleasure, thank you.
That's Will Quince, the MP, who's part of the all-party group on baby loss. Quince, I should say, Will Quince. We're going to be talking about this after 9 o'clock this morning. In fact, one of our dads earlier has written a poem, a really powerful poem called I Pause, which we played much, much earlier on. So we're going to play after 9 o'clock again.
Beautifully written as well, actually.
Yeah.
Real power.
So you can hear that. A couple of texts on this. I'm a 56-year-old twin of a sister that died during birth. My parents and I still don't know where my sister was buried. It's 56 years ago, you see. No grieving process at all. At least now, most parents that go through this tragedy have some excellent support. Another here, my partner's 39 weeks pregnant with our second baby. Listening to the poem you were talking about has made me cry. Stillbirth is one of the most things I most fear. It's absolutely heartbreaking, says Tom in Cheltenham, and many more of your own personal stories. So after 9 o'clock this morning, we'll talk about what impact it's had on you, on your whole family. As I mentioned, that extraordinary poem from a dad whose child was stillborn, you'll hear that just after 9. But we want to hear your story. So we've talked about dads this morning, more dads, but mums, grandparents, who are looking forward to the birth of their grandchild, brothers and sisters. How do you support the rest of your family through this process? I'd love to hear some of your stories. It's your call, Stillbirth, the impact it's had on your family. And this is the number to call, 08085 909 693. The text is 85058. If you find it easier to share via text, that's fine, of course. And we'll continue to talk about this on the 5 Live Facebook page and via Twitter. It's at BBC 5 Live.
First for news and more live Premier League football than anyone else. This is BBC 5 Live.
Good morning, it's 9 o'clock on BBC 5 Live. This is Rachel Burden. It's your call this morning. Stillbirths, how's it affected you and your family as a mother or as a father who's been through this? What about the children in your family? And what about the grandparents as well who experience the loss of a grandchild? We're going to play a poem in a moment written by a father who's been like this. We played it earlier on. It's very, very powerful. But this morning we've been really encouraged by the fact that so many of you have been able to open up and share your stories with us. Lots of the fathers we've had talking about the fact that they didn't necessarily feel able to talk about their grief and to really express it, particularly initially after a stillbirth. So let's hear your experiences this morning. 08085 909 693. 7 minutes past 9 on Thursday morning. This is your call. It's 5 Live. Now, we talk about many difficult subjects here on 5 Live, of course, and one this morning which it's not always easy to listen to. We've been discussing stillbirth, but actually it's an experience that so many families go through. And in particular this morning, we've been focusing on the impact it can have on the whole family. So, of course, the mother who goes through this untold trauma of very often having to give birth to a baby she knows has died, and the impact that can have will be lifelong. But this morning we've also been looking at how other members of the family are affected. We've been hearing the stories of two fathers who've lost their children, and also thinking about siblings, thinking about grandparents. It might be aunts and uncles, the people you're really close to, how they are impacted on by a stillbirth. So we'd love to hear your stories this morning. If you're happy to share them with us, 08085 909 693. If you want to text, it's 85058. And it's at BBC 5 Live via Twitter. We'll talk about it on Facebook as well. Now, before we get to the calls, a number of people have been in touch already. We did want to just take the opportunity to bring you once again a poem written by David Monteith. He was our guest earlier on. He lost his child, as it happened, on the same day as our next guest, Chris. Chris, good morning again, by the way.
Good morning.
Chris and David began talking about their own experiences then. But David in particular wrote this poem. It's called I Pause, and it's in tribute to his daughter, Grace.
There was a pause, then a breath. We drove in our car. The hospital wasn't far, but my breathing was shallow and laboured. My heart was flip-flopping. In my head I was hoping that soon we'd be laughing because my daughter was hopping, trying to avoid the Doppler. Then the lady, she scanned us, and the words she was speaking, which were apparently English, suddenly made sense in my head. I'm sorry, she said. I pause. Then I breathe. It's the only way to relieve the pressure that's bending my chest and punching my brain. My wife's eyes are tearing as grief is searing a path to her soul. And I'm no longer whole because of my grace-shaped hole. A girl with eyes I'll never see. A smile that'll never be. Friends that will never come round, and you say I have to put her in the ground. Grace, I will say it, that's my daughter's name, and I'll own it and shout it out loud. And I need you to know I have said to my friends that my girl wasn't stillborn, she died. And I'm sorry if talking like this ain't a hit, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. And I pause. And I breathe. I'm not ashamed of my dead child whose grave I dug and created, and neither should you of your dear beloved, for they lived for a while and we were elated. Before their bodies were laid in a tomb, they had life in a womb incubated. And while I celebrate life and grieve for her death, I take a drink from my cup. Wait, my 1 week is up? You want me back working? You think I've been shirking when I don't even know who I am? And I pause. And I breathe to shout she was real, to uplift my screaming brothers and sisters. We are parents, no doubt, and it needs to be said that the time for the silence has shifted. And the MPs sat and debated. Yes, brave women spoke, but had my anger abated? Because so many seats they were empty, like my heart when my daughter left me. So screw the taboo. Let's stand up with pride and tell the world of our grief. depression and guilt, I'm giving you notice. My eyes are sparkling again because it's time doctors woke up and the public got broke up because I ain't living in silence no more. See, the quiet inside is too loud to contain. I have to do something. I just can't refrain. So I pause and I breathe. If my continued oration makes you want to sigh, remember that 20,000 babies didn't have to die. For all those grieving whose pain is held up high, get ready. For here comes my battle cry. I am a parent. And just like my daughter, I pause. And unlike my daughter, I breathe. I pause. And I breathe. I pause. And I breathe.
David Monteith, beautifully and very powerfully expressing his experience at the loss of his daughter, Grace, who was stillborn this morning. Chris Binney's with us. We heard from him a little bit earlier on. His son, as I mentioned, Henry, was stillborn, as it happens on the same day that Grace was stillborn. Hi, Chris, again.
Hi, Rachel.
I think one of the most powerful things about that poem is just David's desire to shout about it, to shout about his feelings and to shout about his daughter. So I kind of want to talk about these babies that we've lost this morning as well. Is there anything that you can tell us about Henry that you can share with us?
Well, I think the first thing to say about that is that's David's perception on that is replicated by all of us. And I think society spends a lot of time trying to avoid it because they're worried that they're going to upset parents or they're going to remind them about their babies that died. And we haven't forgotten. We're never going to forget that our babies died. And when people talk to us about them, what they're actually saying is that people are remembering that they lived as well. And that means an awful lot. So people shy away from it and they probably shouldn't. What can I tell you about Henry? Well, I feel like he's changing, moving mountains, even though he's not here. But he was born at 38 weeks and he was perfect. Full head of hair, very big feet. So I think any of us parents that are going through this sort of thing will all have little things that we can remember specifically. Those are the things I remember most. Lots of hair and very big feet.
Did you see you or your wife in him?
Everyone said that they could see me in him. So I guess, that gives you a lot of comfort as well, I think.
It's often the way, isn't it? Babies look like their dads. For you, it was a complete shock because, as I understand it, your wife went in for a relatively routine checkup.
So my wife had a checkup appointment, routine appointment booked a couple of days before her induction date. She was being induced at 38 weeks. She's insulin-dependent diabetic, so she was always being induced at 38 weeks. And they said, we've got a checkup booked in for you on the Wednesday. You're coming in on the Friday. Just come in anyway, and we'll just give you a quick once-over. So she was in Harrogate. I was in Macclesfield, 2.5 hours away, because it was just a routine appointment. There was no reason for me to be there. It was my last day before I started my paternity leave. So, yeah, we had no warnings, no warning signs, no triggers, nothing. It was completely unexpected.
How has she been through this whole process?
She's the strongest woman I've ever met. She just gets on with things. It's some people deal with it by shouting it from the rooftops, and some people just roll their sleeves up and get on with life. And she's certainly a roll her sleeves up kind of woman. 10 months after Henry was stillborn, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. So she's getting pretty good at rolling with punches, if I'm honest.
Wow. What about you then? Were you able to grieve? Well, she sounds like, as you say, an amazingly strong woman, but presumably you must have felt that you had to be there for her support.
Yeah, and David and I talked about it earlier. There's a challenge for fathers in this sort of society's perception of how men should grieve, not specifically in terms of the loss of their baby, but just how men should grieve in general. I think it's magnified when you're talking about the loss of a baby. This perception that actually we should be making sure that our wives are okay. And David talked earlier about how it's difficult for the women if they don't see the emotion in the men as well, because then it creates a divide between the two, and stillbirth can have an enormous impact on relationships as well.
Yeah, I do know. I want to just read you this text from someone who prefers to remain anonymous. Myself and my daughter went to family counselling after our stillborn little girl was born. I'm grateful for that, but my husband didn't and wouldn't. Now, 17 years later, he's getting help. Very many marriages fail after a stillbirth. Mine came close to that. Men try to deal with their partner's grief, but not their own.
Absolutely. I think, and actually, there are a lot more support groups out there now than there maybe were 17 years ago when that family lost their child. And social media helps bring parents together, so there are more avenues out there for mums and dads now to get the help they need separately if they need different help, or I think more importantly getting that help together as a couple, because you're grieving as individuals but you're also grieving as a set of parents. So I think it's really important that those support networks enable couples to process their grief, even if it's different grief, together as a family unit.
Because as you say, everyone will deal with their grief differently, and that's entirely valid, but there needs to be some kind of outlet for that. Chris, we'll talk a bit more about the kind of the charity you're working with and the sort of support that's out there in a moment. I want to bring in Andrew and Jane. Andrew's in Manchester and Jane is in Bishop Stortford. Morning, Andrew. Morning, Jane.
Good morning.
Morning.
Really nice to hear from both of you. Andrew, tell us your story.
So, very similar to Chris in some ways. 4 years ago in September, my wife was 38 weeks pregnant, and she'd gone for a routine appointment, which is actually just around the corner from where we live. And I was off ill. I always remember that day. I was off ill for the first time in a long, long time. Then the midwife or the local midwife had said that she couldn't find a heartbeat, but she was sure that it was nothing to worry about, but probably best to go and get it checked out at the hospital. So my wife actually picked me up on the way, and she drove up to the hospital. And when we got there, it was confirmed by the midwives at the hospital that unfortunately there was no heartbeat, and that was the situation we were in, and we had to deal with it.
And what happened next?
So we obviously took some time to understand that, and we got some phenomenal help from the NHS, and particularly the midwives that were there at the time. And we were taken through the options because, as was spoke about earlier on your show, you're left with the baby inside my wife, or Philippa inside my wife. And that needs to come out. My natural reaction at that point was start to worry about my wife, and worry how she was going to get through it, not only mentally but also physically at that point. So we went through the options with the consultant around whether to have a cesarean or whether to have a natural birth, and we went for the natural birth option. So at that point. We had we got a 4-year-old son, James, at home, who my parents were looking after. So I needed to go and speak to them and felt I needed to do that face to face. So left my wife with her parents, asked them to look after James for the evening. They were obviously distraught as well with the news. And then about 7 o'clock that evening, I got back to the hospital, and my wife was induced, and we had Philippa around about 11 o'clock that evening.
Can you tell us about Philippa?
Yeah, she was beautiful, absolutely stunning. She was perfect in every way, apart from she wasn't breathing. My wife was obviously giving birth. So when Philippa was born, she was passed to me, and I was sat in the chair next to my wife, and I held her. And she was still warm. And she felt perfect in every way. There was no noise. There was no noise whatsoever. But then we spent some time with her. The midwives were phenomenal. My wife was amazing. And we spent some time with her. And then we had to let go. About 2 days later, we managed to let go and leave the hospital, but all 1.5 days later. but she was amazing in every way. Apart from one, probably the most important.
Jane.
Good morning, Rachel. My story is a little different. There's a bit more time. My son was born 22 years ago, December the 6th, 1995. And when I gave birth to Ben, we already knew that, he died. And I went into shock. So they took him away. And I didn't get to hold him until the next morning. And sadly, they had to keep him in the mortuary. So when I got to hold him, he was cold. And I think of everything, I would like to think that's changed, that you're warned. I wasn't even warned that he would be cold, and I didn't register that he would be cold. And the hardest thing is that no one ever knows your child. And when people say to me, I've got a 31-year-old and a 24-year-old, and they say, how many children have you got? And you always want to say, I've got 3 boys. But you can't, because you don't want to embarrass the other person. You don't want to say, I've got 2 sons and I had a stillbirth. I've now got a tattoo on my wrist, and I'm 55, and I waited until I was 53 to get a tattoo on my wrist that just says Ben Tolf, 6th of the 12th, 95. And I still to this day think, who will he have been like? Would he have been like his older brother? Would he have been like his middle brother, his other older brother? Would he have been like his mom? Would he have been like his dad? And you never quite get through that. What would they have been like? And I chose not to have any more children after that. And because for a long time, Ben was the elephant in the room. He wasn't spoken about. And I took a long time to deal with it, because I felt that, I'd failed him because he died inside me. And, we went, oddly enough, we were at his grave on Saturday. And on his grave, on his headstone, I had to think long and hard, and I've got Ben Tolf's, we never knew your love, but you'll always have ours. Because you don't know this child. You don't know what they would have been like, but you'll always love them. Always love them. And I often joke with my boys, as even now they'll do something and I'll tell them off, and I'll say my Ben would have been perfect. I've never had to tell him off. The only thing I've had to tell him off for was for dying. He should never have done that. And it's hard. And when I rang in this morning, I thought I won't cry, because, these other parents are going to be ringing up, and theirs is going to be more painful because it's more recent. But then you start to think about him, and you start to talk about him, and what's 22 years? It's nothing. I should be having what wouldn't be my little boy, he'd be my man. And I don't know what he would be doing, whether he'd gone to university, what he would have done. And you have all those unanswered questions about their lives. Sorry, I didn't mean to cry.
Don't say sorry. There's absolutely no need to say sorry, and you're not going to be the only person crying this morning, believe me.
No, I won't. And the other thing I will say is this, that there's a lot of well-meaning people who, time will heal. All time does is ease the pain. It does not heal. Because this is the sort of healing, you should never, ever bury your child, no matter whether they're stillborn or alive. But stillborn is really cruel, because you don't get to know them.
I want to bring Chris back in here. Andrew, you're still with us. Are you okay, Andrew?
Yes, I'm fine.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, just first of all, to all of you, thank you so much. It is, we are privileged that you're happy and able to share your stories with us. And Chris, you reacting to those experiences as they were told to us by Andrew and Jane.
Yeah, I mean, Jane's captured it absolutely perfectly. Jane, I'm terribly sorry for the loss of your son, Ben.
Thank you.
stillbirth and the loss of a baby is a very specific kind of bereavement, because you're not just losing your child, you're losing birthdays, you're losing Christmases, you're losing first days at school, you're losing graduations, you're losing driving tests, you're losing weddings. You lose all of that in an instant. And as an expectant parent, you have all of that mapped out in your mind. And in a heartbeat, everything that you were planning, everything you were expecting, everything that you were anticipating with joy for the rest of your life as a parent just disappears in front of you. And I think that's what makes it a very specifically difficult type of bereavement.
Yeah. Andrew, how has it been in terms of living with this now and the support you feel you have as a father? And I'm also interested to know, because we're talking about the impact on the whole family, you talk about your grandparents who must have been devastated by the loss of their grandchild, and then a 3-year-old. How do you explain to a 3-year-old what's happened?
So I mean, we were really fortunate in that our experience, and I'm always thankful to people like Jane who've been through the experience in the past. And my auntie had a stillbirth when she in the 50s, and the story that goes along with that is horrendous. So I'm thankful for those people who've been through a horrendous experience that made the experience that I and my wife went through so much better. I'm not sure I could have coped if it wasn't for the strength of those people around us at the hospital. But sort of since then, there was lots of advice given to us in the days after, whilst we were still at the hospital. And we read quite a bit of literature about how to tell my son, and that was the main concern that me and my wife had at that time, was how we broke the news to him. And they provide, or there were boxes that we were given, or there was a box that we were given at the hospital, a memory box, and within there were things like teddy bears and a little nappy and a box of trinkets and things like that. And there were 2 teddy bears in there, and what we decided to do was bring James into the hospital before we left the room that we were staying in, and actually talk to him about what had happened. And he was 3, so we had to be careful around the words that we used, but we were very specific in saying that the baby was dead and that it wouldn't be coming home. And what we chose to do was that there were 2 teddy bears, and we gave 1 teddy bear to James, and we put 1 teddy bear with Philippa. And James still has that teddy bear to this day. He doesn't play with it all the time. It's sort of sat in his bedroom, but he certainly knows where it's been or where it came from, which we're really thankful for.
Andrew,
but in terms, sorry.
No, go on.
In terms of my grandparents, my parents, I think you forget, and it only became relevant to me. Recently I was at an organisation called STANDS. I'm part of that organisation, and we just set up a local group, and there were some grandparents who came, or a grandparent who came and talked to us. And her experience sort of opened my eyes that actually grandparents not only are feeling the loss and sorrow of losing a grandchild and the expectations and things that Chris spoke about, but also they see their child, their baby, in pain, and they can't fix that pain. Yeah. It's like they can't just put a plaster on it and say, on your way. They can't comprehend the pain that their child is going through, and that in itself is a heartbreaking thing that I can certainly empathise with. Yeah,
and look, we'll put out the names and numbers of the kind of organisations that offer support by the end of the programme. Andrew, thank you so much, and Jane, we really, really do appreciate it. A number of texts here. And for those people who perhaps think this is a difficult listen, then just have a listen to this text. I've just heard David's poem. I had to pull into the services to send this text. It was the most powerful piece of poetry I've ever heard. It surfaced something in me that I haven't emotionally dealt with over the last 3 years, and it's inspired me to seek the help and the support I need. Thank you. And I think that's why it's so important, Chris, why we talked all those weeks ago about why it was important to be talking about this. Another here, my cousin had a stillbirth 4 years ago, and it's hard enough for us as a peripheral family. I cannot imagine what a parent goes through. We'll always remember, but it's heartbreaking. Here's another. My mum had a stillborn baby. The midwife said to a nurse, get rid of that thing, talking about the baby in front of my mum. My father still gets upset and angry that they never knew what happened to the body. And this one, myself and my daughter went into family counselling after our little girl was born, but my husband never sought out similar support. Thank you for those, 85058 or at BBC5 Live if you want to contact us via Twitter, or if you'd like to call us as well and talk to us this morning. And Chris is here, 08085 909 693, that's the number to call. It's 9:32. Good morning, it's your call, it's 9:41. We're talking about babies who are stillborn this morning and talking about the impact that has on families, whether it's mothers, fathers, their siblings, grandparents, or the wider family. And we're very privileged that you've been sharing your experiences with us this morning. Chris Binney's here. He lost his son, Henry, how many years ago now, Chris?
Just coming up 3.5.
Do you want to talk about the pine cone, or would you prefer not to?
You can talk about the pine cone if you like.
So Chris is holding a pine cone, and I know about this because Chris and I have met before. Do you want to tell us about the pine cone?
I suppose I'll just explain the context. Without people's children with them, a lot of people look for symbols that represent their children, and for a lot of parents it's butterflies or feathers or rainbows. Our son Henry's buried under a pine tree at the cemetery in Harrogate, and so when we first started going up to his grave, we became very aware of the fact that there were pine cones scattered all over the place. And I guess you've always had this thing that little boys love picking up pine cones and mucking around with them. So pine cones have become a very visual representation for us of Henry.
And it's been in your hand all morning.
It has.
Yeah, all the time, I know, don't you? That's Chris. So he's been through this. He also works now with a charity. What is the charity that supports parents?
So the charity that I'm part of is called Our Angels. It's a Harrogate-based support group. I first became aware of their existence because they provide the memory boxes that Andrew spoke about earlier for Harrogate Hospital. And I think that's a really important thing, because what that memory box says to parents at that moment in time is actually, whether it comes from Our Angels or any of the other charities that do them, you're not on your own. There are parents out there who have been through this and are creating these pieces, whether they're memory boxes or specialist equipment like the cold cots, to enable you to get through your journey. And you are part of a community that you didn't know existed, you never wanted to be part of, but actually once you start to meet these people, you realise that you're really, really glad that you know them. So I first became aware of Our Angels as a group when we got that memory box. We went to a support. We meet a support group monthly, and we went to the support group meeting a couple of months later. And we're 3.5 years down the line, I can safely say that the men and women in that group are amongst my closest friends in the world now.
And this is why it's good to talk, and this is why it's good to share experiences. Some of the texts we've had this morning, I would like to thank Ben's mum, who we heard earlier, Jane. I lost my stepson at 36 2 years ago, and this is the first time I have managed to cry, says Jim in Northampton. Another here, the loss of a child any age, pre-birth or otherwise, is devastating. It's been over 23 years since I lost my 1-year-old daughter, Felicity, and I think of her every day. I have a new family now, 4 boys. My original marriage did not survive the loss of my daughter. It was too great. My advice is to seek help. I didn't. I probably should have. Thank you, Doug. And this one here, this conversation is so, so important to have. Thank you so much for sharing the brutal reality of what bereaved families experience. Our entire family will always feel the loss of our son, Leo Phoenix. Not a day goes by that he isn't missing from us all. Much love to everyone sharing their experiences today, and thank you. Tim is in Nottinghamshire, and Annie's in Suffolk. Hi, Tim. Hi, Annie.
Hi.
Tim, you lost your daughter, Lydia. Tell us about her. This was, 13 years ago now?
Yes, it was September the 10th, 2004, and me and my partner Anne, we'd met not long before, 3 or 4 months before she got pregnant, and then to find out that she had twins, she was going to have twins, we were just overjoyed, of course, and completely terrified. And then moving on to September, the babies were due to be born in October of 2004, and so it was at 38 weeks that Anne went for a routine scan in hospital. I was at work and I got the call from I think it was from Anne. We were talking about it this morning, and she said, "You've got come now, and I knew something was seriously wrong, and I think I knew it was that. I don't know if I just didn't, I blocked it out. So I got a train to the hospital from Sheffield to Chesterfield, and just to find that indeed the baby's heartbeat had gone. So we were faced with the fact that Barney, who was going to be our little boy, he it's difficult. He was needed to be got out quickly, so and was given an emergency C-section to deliver Barney and to deliver Lydia. So that was at 38 weeks.
And at 38 weeks, actually, because that was the same time that Chris's son Henry was born.
That's right.
You sort of think everything's going to be okay, don't you?
Yeah. I just like to say it was one of those situations where you to get over it, you rank your situation to rationalise it. I produced a little list. Number one, losing one baby with nothing to show. That's got to be the most terrible thing. And then the second one, a baby dying after you got to know him or her. You think that would be terrible. So to rationalise, I put it at number three, having a surviving twin as a consolation. But it's just one of those things where you don't know. Your emotions are all over the place. You're supposed to be joyful and full of grief at the same time.
No, there's no league table for these things. There just isn't.
No, but you just do that to rationalise.
No, I understand. Tell us what it's been. Well, first of all, tell us about Lydia. Now, 13 years ago, I don't know how much it's changed now. Did you have time to spend with her?
We were in a separate little room in the hospital, and I just decided I needed to be quite strong. I don't think I'm the strongest of the two. I think Anne's stronger than me, but I decided I needed to be strong. So I did hold Lydia, but Anne just couldn't bring herself to do it. And I know she does regret it, but she just couldn't do it at the time. And the hospital were good. There was a fantastic grief specialist midwife called Lynn, who was very sensitive, just struck the right tone. She was great.
Yeah.
And the consultant was a big sort of not matter of fact, but sort of a big gangly Lancastrian called Steve, who was more went with the facts and what was going on. And that suited our background, because Anne and I are both from a journalistic background, so we're used to dealing with tragedy. But when you're confronted with it, it's a bit different.
And what's it been like for Barney growing up then, not having his twin sister around him?
Well, we told him. I can't remember what age we told him. I think it was he's 13 now, so it was about probably 9 or 10. 10, I would have thought. And he's very inquisitive, and he just wanted to know, answer loads of questions. But he took it on board, and I think he deals with it. He deals with it pretty well. He's not spoken about it quite as much since, I don't think. But his brothers, we've got Leo's 10 and Archie, who's 8. I don't think it's truly filtered through to them. We have gone most years to a special service for parents who've lost children, either stillbirth or babies or older children, and that's given some consolation as a sort of a ritual, really.
Yeah.
None of the rest are religious, but it's better at the hospital, and in latter years you've released balloons, and that's good because the kids will love that, because it's just something to do, and they wrote little cards.
It's about recognition, though, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Annie, it was a number of years ago that you lost your little boy.
Yes, it was. It was in January 1985, so quite some time ago now. But it's, when you listen to the conversations that have been going on the radio this morning, it just brings it back like it was yesterday, which, you know, it was a long time ago, but it doesn't change anything. You know, it doesn't change your emotions or what you went through. And then a lot of it I can remember like it was yesterday, and some things that were just a complete blur. My circumstances were that I went up for a routine scan. It seems to be what's being said this morning, which is a bit, sad, but I was 37 and a half weeks and I was due to go to Ipswich Hospital. So my husband took me up there, and they did the scan, and I knew something wasn't right because the nurse left the room. You know, you get a bit of an instinct about these things. And she came back with the consultant, and he checked the scan, and he said, "I'm really sorry." He said, "But your baby has died." And my whole world fell apart. Literally. So we just went into complete shock, really. Then you have to go through all the decisions that have to be made about giving birth to the child. And I was frightened. It was my first child. I was absolutely terrified. So they did everything they could to try and, you know, calm me and tell me what was going to happen. I said, was it an option to have a C-section? And he said, not, because of the fear of infection. He said, I want you to have a normal delivery. And so I had to be induced, which took nearly 24 hours. They took me up into a ward, into a private room, which they were lucky enough, I suppose, to have at the time with my husband. And they just had to start me off, and I had to deliver our little boy, you know, and it took forever. It just seemed like an eternity, to be honest. And then they took him away, and they brought him back later. And I'm probably going to say something I regret, really, because I never could bring myself to hold him. We both had him by my bedside, and we just looked at him, and then they took him away.
What was he called, Annie?
We didn't call him anything, which again I sometimes think maybe I should have done, but actually it's okay because he's there in my heart all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
so it was pretty traumatic. I don't know where I do know where he's buried. He's buried in the old cemetery at Ipswich, but he's in an unmarked grave. So I don't know where he is. They had, I joined an organisation called SANS, which was, a bit of it was brilliant, really. They were fantastic. And then the lady who ran it was actually a nurse at the hospital who'd also lost a child. Anyway, they've set up a memorial in the cemetery that we can visit when we want to go to the cemetery, but I actually physically don't know where he is. I don't even know if I can find out. I haven't had the strength or the courage to even go to the hospital to speak to anybody about it. So, you move on. I had some pretty awful experiences afterwards in terms of, and these are the physical things, like all your milk comes in as a mother, which was just horrendous. I had lots of friends in antenatal who were producing at the same time. Not lost a lot of friends, but didn't get any calls. No one really sort of knew how to deal with it, I suppose, in a way. So you go through a lot of that. I had people pass me in the street in our local town because they didn't know what to say to me. All kinds of things which I don't blame them for. It is the most traumatic experience any parent can go through. And I think it was just the complete shock of it. Completely, I've got no other word for it. I just, we were in complete meltdown. The staff were fantastic at Ipswich, and they did what they could at the time. But of course, it all sounds very archaic. Listening to the gentleman who's in the studio with this morning, thank goodness things have changed.
Well, let's bring him in now. This is Chris. For those listeners who are just joining us, who lost his son Henry 3 years ago. What do you make of what you've heard from Annie and Tim?
Every time I hear a story, it breaks my heart all over again, because there's so many people out there, and we can see it from the responses you're getting today, how many people are affected by this that haven't had an outlet to talk about it because society just steers around it, whether that's people crossing the street to avoid talking to you, or my great friend Emma talks about people disappearing down other aisles in the supermarket and sort of chasing them frantically around the supermarket with a trolley, trying to bring that conversation round. It's the most isolating experience that I think anyone can go through, because society just doesn't know how to handle it. I'm really pleased to say that there have been a lot of improvements, but there's still a lot more to do. We've been talking about people that haven't had the chance to spend time with their baby, and bereavement suites and the cold cots that allow you to spend more time with your child are all really important things.
Annie, I don't know if you know about cold cots, but perhaps you could explain, Chris. Is this something that wouldn't have been around in 1985?
No, I've never heard of it.
And it's still not available routinely. A lot of hospitals have them. Many hospitals have had them donated by local SANS groups or other charities in their area.
These are cots that effectively, gosh, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as it's designed to slow the deterioration of the baby, to enable you to spend more time with them.
So you could spend potentially several days with your baby. Just being able to get to know that child.
And I think what I hear when I talk to parents and professionals that are dealing with these parents is actually that's a really important part of the processing of it mentally and emotionally. And we listened to some of the people that have rung in today talking about how they've struggled to process that when it happened 20, 30, 32 years ago. And I think that's a lot to do with it. So things like bereavement suites are so important. But as we talked about earlier, there are still 1/3 of hospitals in the UK that don't have a dedicated bereavement midwife, don't have a dedicated bereavement suite. So there's been a lot of very positive developments, but there's still a lot more to do.
Well, I'm really pleased to hear it because, strangely, my daughter is a nurse at Ipswich Hospital now, and it's good that the profession is listening because I think it's really important. But the other thing I wanted to really say this morning, because there will be lots of people out there listening, just like I have been this morning, is that There was light at the end of the tunnel for us. My husband and I, we've been lucky enough to go on to have 3 beautiful children, and they're 30, 29 and 28. And I managed to have 3 children in 2.5 years. And I was so blessed and felt so privileged to be able to bring up 3 lovely children. So that's been a blessing for us.
Yeah, and it's not always that straightforward for other families who go through
this. It isn't. And I had a miscarriage after my stillbirth as well. So it was a tough time. But just to go on to we chose to tell our children when they were about 9, 10, 11, something like that.
About the same age as Tim. You were saying it was around that age.
I'd like to echo those sentiments that you can go one of 2 ways. You can let that stillbirth define your family life and never have children again, which is understandable. Or you can say, well, no, that's not going to beat us. We too.
No, well, and it's they're difficult decisions because you're so frightened. And I was very fortunate that the consultant who had delivered the bad news was able to deliver our 3 children.
Annie and Tim, we have to leave it there. And I am so sorry. And Chris, thank you so much. I wanted to have time just finally, and thank you so much to everyone who's got in contact today, to give out just a bit of information. So you can go to SANS or Tommy's Bliss, the Lullaby Trust, the Miscarriage Association. They'll all give you support. But I also just want to remember today all the babies that we've heard about. So Grace, Henry with his hair and big feet, Philippa, Ben, Lydia and Annie's little boy who we heard about at the end. Thank you to everyone who told us their stories this morning. And we'll continue this on Facebook, of course, as well.